Hey everybody, welcome back to another world history class. This time we're going to be talking about transatlantic slavery, the transatlantic slave trade, specifically the second half of it, looking at the sort of creolization of culture across the Atlantic, and the sort of resistance to the slave trade, abolition movements, these kinds of things. Picking up from last time, if you're watching this one before the first one, go back and watch the first one, otherwise you'll kind of miss out. Otherwise, let's get going. So like I said, this time we'll be looking at creolization and sort of transatlantic lives. We'll talk about resistance to the slave trade, and then we'll talk about the eventual abolition of the slave trade, although that's going to play out over hundreds of years. It's not a real quick sort of thing, as we'll see. It's much more of a long, drawn-out process for everyone involved. So the first thing we're going to talk about today, since we already talked about the sort of kingdoms and empires in Africa, the political situation there, the start of the slave trade with the Portuguese, right? Gold, sugar, moving people over to the Caribbean or to Brazil. And we sort of talked about some of the early reactions and changes in demographics. This time we're going to start by talking about the sort of new mixings of cultures. So creolization is kind of a funny word. I'll give you a more specific sort of definition of it in just a second. But basically, you're thinking about African cultures and traditions merging with European and American traditions and cultures. And this is going to lead to a brand new set of people, a brand new sort of group, a new diaspora forming, but also just different ways of sort of doing things. So these millions of enslaved Africans that were transported across the Atlantic, they didn't remain African, at least not in the sense that they were before. The old foods, the old places, the old religions, the old languages, in a way that stuff is all gone because the community they're coming from is gone, at least to them. At the same time, they're not going to become European, they're not going to become Native American, right? There's going to be some other thing that happens. They're going to blend cultures. They're not going to retain their Africanness fully, whatever that may have been like, and they're not going to become Euro-American either. There's going to be some new sets of cultural practices and lifestyles that have a lot of unexpected outcomes that remain sort of prominent in the Americas today. So the first thing to think about is that most, if not all, enslaved Africans that were brought to the Caribbean or Brazil or the United States eventually were put on plantations to grow cash crops, to do heavy manual labor on farms. Sometimes textbooks for like middle schoolers and stuff describe this as chores. Ooh, not chores, man. You're talking about heavy back-breaking labor, for 12-hour days, sort of all over. The labor is heavily divided on these plantations by race. So they're often other workers. They're sometimes indentured servants. They're sometimes poor whites that are working as well. But the way the labor system is set up, they don't always work with each other, or they don't even often work with each other. Also, the sort of capitalists are almost entirely composed of white Europeans. So the labor is sort of divided that way. The sorts of things they were growing, sugar at first, right? We talked about the Portuguese moving sugar to Sao Tome and then to Brazil and stuff like this. But also tobacco, right, is a new crop for Europeans. They've never really seen it before. A lot of Native Americans actually like ferment it down into a juice and drink it. Other Native Americans dry it out and smoke it. That version becomes kind of popular, right? It starts going back to Europe. People are hip to it. Start to see cigarettes eventually, pipe smoking, things like that. But also rice, cotton, coffee, a lot of other sort of basic commodities that could be shipped to Europe to either feed workers or serve as the base for European products like jute or dyes and stuff like this. The extreme physical labor, as we saw, led to really high mortality rates. Remember, about 2/3 of the population is men. These groups are not necessarily able to reproduce on their own. Also, their life expectancy can be pretty short. So this leads to this desire for slaveholders to continuously bring in and import new people to work on the plantations. And so what happens is, on these plantations, you get a sort of site where lots of different people are mixing and mingling that wouldn't have known each other before. And here it's really important to remember that Africa is not just one place. It's not a country. It's not a thing. There were tons and tons of different languages, peoples, cultures, foods all over, even just in small areas in West Africa. And so all of these slaves coming to plantations would have been from different areas, most likely. And that led to just a giant sort of merger of different cultures that had previously been very separate, but now were kind of seen as one thing in opposition to being white, to being Portuguese, to being European, etc. So all of these cash crops that were getting grown, they didn't sort of come out of nowhere. And I said tobacco, right, is coming from the sort of Americas. But interestingly, there's another product that's really common early on that we kind of forget about now that sort of shows how Africans were involved in this process. Often the idea is there were white planters, which is kind of a funny word, right? Because planters never really planted anything. That's the word we use typically for like owners of the plantations. But the people who actually did all the planting and growing and harvesting were, of course, Africans. And when they did this, they brought with them a certain knowledge of these foods. And one really clear example of this is rice. The Carolinas, Georgia, used to grow tons of rice in the sort of early slave trading days. And this was in Brazil as well, parts in the Caribbean. And here you have sort of depictions of this. On the left, you have some enslaved folks digging trenches in a wet paddy, right, to grow rice. On the right, you have a recreation of the sort of tools that were used to pound rice to harvest off the shaft, right, the sort of stuff you don't want to eat. If you've seen like white rice or even brown rice, it's not all enclosed, right, in the bran of the rice. This is a traditional African method for removing that so that you can get to the grain that's actually really edible. So the sort of technique and knowledge of it was indeed African. More than that even, the rice itself was from Africa. So often I think Americans think of rice as a sort of Asian product, or they think of it Chinese food, Japanese food, maybe they think India or something, right? Tons of rice. But nowadays, obviously, like if you go to Mexico, people are eating tons of rice and stuff like that, right? It's involved in other cultures. Foodways, as we talked about, due to the Columbian exchange. But here you can see a unique thing. This is African rice. This rice was indigenous to West Africa. Slaves brought it with them. It was farmed in the Americas because it turned out to be a great cash crop. But this is not rice from Asia. This is rice that was from Africa. So even on the plantations, while slaves are in this position of abuse and exploitation, they're still the ones providing the knowledge and, in some cases, even the crops that make the system function. So with all that in mind, we can think of this process of creolization happening on this new site, the plantation. By necessity, you're going to get new communities that begin to emerge. These folks from Africa are going to try to survive. In order to do that, they're going to have to mix and match all the pieces they have left of their own cultures with American cultures, with European cultures, and make something new that still provides the basic things they need: a working language, a common ethnicity, some sort of religious ideology, histories, things like this have to get kind of cobbled together from existing materials. So the first thing we might look at, the most basic thing, is language. You have all of these Africans from different places in West Africa, Central Africa. They do not speak the same language. Some of them would have been literate in Arabic as a kind of common Islamic language, but for the most part, they would have spoken their own local dialects, and that would not have been intelligible to each other. So on the plantation, in slave-based societies, European language dominated. The owners of the plantation would have spoken Spanish, Portuguese, English, and they would not feel like learning African languages. It wasn't going to happen. So the enslaved the enslavers, the people who owned slaves, would use their native languages, and they would demand that slaves at least learn the basics of those languages to be able to function. If someone with a whip is telling you to do something, you want to be able to understand what they're telling you to avoid getting beat by those people. So even though African languages were spoken too, there had to be some movement to adapt European-based languages. So these African and European languages are going to mix. At first, they're in these sorts of pidgin languages, right? It's like common vocalizations that you can kind of understand, that you can communicate with each other, but soon they become sophisticated, fully separate languages amongst these communities. A really great example is the Gullah Geechee people that are actually right here in Georgia. If you haven't heard of this, I got a little video for you to check out. So I'll play this. It gives a great example of how these languages mixed and what they actually sound like. See if you can pick up the sort of languages that are being combined here in the communication.
I want Jesus to walk with me when I'm on my lonesome journey. Lord, I want Jesus. I want Jesus to walk with me. Well, I die the day now for tell Huna something about my ancestor them. I can feel the presence day the day with me now, because I know it'll watch over me. I grew up not knowing where I came from, or how I got here, and why am I being treated as less than a human. You know, our grandmother said, now the buckra children go there. And don't look buckra in the eye. So I can't go over there no for play with them buckra them. We knew that the whites were different, but we didn't really know why. So it was just another day in the life of a little Gullah girl. To walk with me. And they been ya on these hallowed and sacred grounds on this place we call Edisto Island, where I grew up. Oh, freedom. Oh, freedom. Almost everybody that lived on this island were enslaved Africans, all Gullah people. And the island they had nothing but plantation. And all they call on the white gold, you know. The cotton and the rice and all the indigo. The enslaved Africans had to find a way to communicate. So that language was pretty much born here in America.
Yeah, tell us now y'all can eat all the trees of the garden. But the day you eat that tree in the middle of the garden, that'll be the day you die.
My generation is really the last generation to have direct contact with Gullah-speaking people, and Gullah was their only language.
You see a little red apple hanging on the tree?
And unless we pass it on to our children, then it will die out.
And Mom and Bob Taylor says,
He strip everything from her. All the children that snatch out the arm, carry the baby this way, the mad that way, the pad that way. And they mean they had no sense of family at all. We have to let our young people know about the struggle. We have to go all the way back to Africa, where it all began, so that they know whose back they're standing on. And before I'd be a slave, I'd be buried in my grave and go home to my God and be free and be free.
Okay, so there you saw the sort of historical legacy, right? These new languages that are emerging. You have English, French, various African dialects that got compressed into a new sort of version. Yeah, it's English in that I can kind of understand some of it because it uses a lot of English words, but there's lots of other things that I'm like, I kind of have to reach on, right? Like, I know the French word for white, so that kind of works. But you know, there's Spanish, there's obviously any of the derivatives from African languages, I don't know. So they're definitely mixing and matching those to make a workable language for that community. In the same way, you can look at foods and see this process unfold. Here we got a plate of gumbo, right on top of some rice. So this is a really interesting, gumbo is like a whole sort of time capsule for transatlantic slavery, and it really shows how these things were mixing. Okay, you got those shrimp, right? Those are from the Gulf. That's just a very common, popular food. You got okra in there. That okra is coming originally from West Africa. So those are foods that were brought with the enslaved peoples. The style of cooking is African. The rice was probably an African derivative, but it was brought to the Americas. It would have been all grown in the Americas. But also other things like the seasoning, the chili, the filet, right, that makes it thicker. Those were all Native American products that were used in Native American food. So you have this big mix of stuff. It's kind of from everywhere and nowhere, and it's compressed to be something genuinely new in these Black communities. And you can find this all over in the Caribbean, in Brazil, in Eastern Mexico, in the United States. It's a really common sort of thing to see because people have to eat. They want to eat the things they remember from home. They might have some traditional foods that they enjoy, but there's another process going on here. A lot of these sort of Creole foods include products like molasses or bones. These are the things that would have been sort of thrown out. You make when you're making sugar, the result is that nice, you know, fine powdered sugar or white sugar or even sort of brown sugar. But the stuff that you pull out of it, when you're evaporating the sugar juice to get the sugar, there's this sort of byproduct you can pull out that's molasses. So a lot of enslaved communities would use molasses because it still has a lot of nutrient value, but it's basically something that was thrown away from the sugar process. Same with the bones. Obviously, animals were raised and slaughtered and used to prepare, you know, nice food for the plantation owners and for white folks and for the people in the city. But there would have been lots of other things left over, bones and hooves and stuff like this, that would have been thrown out. And essentially, people are going to make do with what they can. Things like dumplings, right, are like a weird mix. They kind of have an African origin, they kind of have a British origin. It's funky. But these are all things that we think about when we think about these sort of Creole foods. There are all kinds of mixtures of American and Afro-Eurasian foods, cooking techniques, products. Then there's this sort of legacy of being able to get what you can. And these foods are tied to a sort of survival or a sort of reality that slaves faced. They couldn't be eating filet mignon, that just wasn't going to happen. So you ate the stuff that other people didn't necessarily want or threw out. There's a reason for these sorts of things. It's not just stereotypes and stuff like that. Another sort of aspect we might look at is obviously when you're talking culture, music and dance are a big part of it. These new Creole communities had a sort of foundational problem when they first form. If you can't speak to each other, maybe you can do something else to communicate, right? Music is always good. You might not be able to speak French or something, but if you're in France at a dance club and you can dance, right? Who cares? You're out there dancing. It's the same thing. So a lot of these communities that were sort of forced together from various places wouldn't have been able to communicate with each other, but they could communicate with each other through music. So initially, very early on, you see lots of these Creole communities adopting music that's a mix, particularly drumming from Africa, dancing from Africa, mixed with some new European instruments that were available or that Europeans demanded slaves play for them. And so you get things like this. Here we see a drum. This was found in Virginia in like 1760 or something like that. And the British people who found it thought it was a Native American drum. They sent it off to a museum in London, but it wasn't. This was an African drum that had been brought either by a slave or by slave traders to Virginia and was used in those communities for a while before being found by the British, and they thought it was a Native American product or something. But a lot of these communities would drum, particularly at night after work, as a sort of relaxation, entertainment. And of course, this made the white folks really nervous. They didn't like that out at night there were people drumming and dancing and socializing and stuff. So there were often movements to repress this. But when you try to repress people's music or dance or communication in this way, it never really works out. We'll get more into that later, but that's how you start to get like Jim Crow laws and these sorts of things are derived from, the word Jim Crow is like derived from a particular type of dance that white folks thought that black folks were doing. Anyway, all that stuff's kind of coming down the line. We'll talk more about that later. But let me show you an example of modern day dancing that's done in West Africa. This little clip I'm going to show is from the Côte d'Ivoire, the Ivory Coast. And of course, this is modern. This is what people are doing there now. But it looks pretty similar to what African folks would have been doing around the Caribbean, around Brazil, around the Americas. And you might notice that it looks like a lot of stuff we still have, like Carnival, or you might notice other similarities. So let's just check that out, and then we'll get back. Okay, yeah, pretty amazing. I could kind of watch that stuff all day. The music's a little tinny just because it was maybe a bad recording on my end or whatever. But really amazing stuff. If you think you could do any of that, man, I don't know, check your calves. Like, it seems like my legs just fall off. But pretty amazing, and you can see, like a lot of students when I've shown that before have been like, oh yeah, that looks, someone in my class says, oh, that looks, yeah, just like Carnival or something, or just like Louisiana when they do, this and that. It's like, yeah, there's a reason for that. right? It's deeply connected. So other than food and dancing and language, what do we do when this all combines, right? Can we think about these things being combined in a person? What about a transatlantic individual? So not just culture, not just language, but like a real person who's somehow manufactured, right? Who's somehow made in this environment that's not quite African, not quite European, not quite American. What is it? What might these people look like? Well, here's one, for example. Francisco Menendez. So you'll notice, right, he has a Spanish name. That's a drawing of him. There's no pictures, right? Because there's not pictures for quite a while. So in the late 1600s, at some point, he was enslaved in West Africa. The timelines for this stuff is always a little bit tricky because no one was keeping great records. He didn't know when he was born, things like that. He was transported across the Atlantic to Barbados and then to South Carolina. In South Carolina, he is not content, as most slaves were not content. We'll get to the sort of myth later of contented slaves. That's, of course, garbage. So in 1715, he joined a group of Native Americans, the Yamasee. They were in a rebellion against the British because in 1715, remember, it's not the United States yet. In South Carolina, it's filled with British people, not Americans. So he's going to join this rebellion against the British, and it's not going to go very well. As you might know from other history classes or whatever, the British are eventually going to destroy most Native American communities in the sort of original colonies. However, he manages to escape, and he flees down to Florida. But at this time, Florida was a Spanish colony. So he was able to stay there, even though he was a runaway slave and he had been in an insurrection against Britain, if he converted to Catholicism. Because under the Spanish law at the time, if you were a Catholic, you couldn't be enslaved. So he takes a Spanish name, he becomes Catholic, and then he is free in Florida. He can't leave, of course. He could be arrested outside of Florida as a runaway slave or something. But over the next dozen years or so, he gains a lot of credibility in his community. He comes to be seen as a leader. He had fought against slavery. He had fought against the British. And he becomes the leader of a town called Fort Mose. This was the first free black community in what today is the United States. It was there in Florida, and it lasts for a while. But after about 20 years or so, 25 years, the British are going to acquire Florida from Spain. When the British acquire Florida from Spain, Menendez isn't going to become a British citizen again. He's not going to be re-enslaved. There's this town filled with free black folks, and he's going to leave, right? He's going to try and take his community, and they're going to leave, and they're going to aim for Cuba, right, which is still a Spanish colony. So this is just one example of this guy that has this incredible life, from being enslaved in Africa to ending up in South Carolina to leading a free town of black folk in Florida to evacuating that town to get down into the Caribbean. Where's this guy's movie, right? I mean, this is like a really incredible story. But there's tons of people like this at the time. Another person who has this sort of like amazing story is Thomas Peters. So he's about 100 years later here in terms of, or not 100 years, but 80 years later or something in terms of when he's captured. He's picked up by French slavers and he's taken to Louisiana. There he's sold a bunch because, again, like most slaves, he tried to get the hell out of there. He resisted slavery. So he tries to escape a lot. His owners get upset by that. They just keep selling him off. So he is kind of always on the move. But the Revolutionary War is about to start, right? So in 1776, when there's the Declaration of Independence and stuff, Peters is going to join the Black Pioneers. If you haven't heard about the Black Pioneers, this is really funky too. The British are on the way towards ending slavery. And when the American Revolution starts, the newly forming US government is pro-slavery. So Britain says to them, to the black folks in the US, if you fight for Britain, you'll gain your freedom. When Britain wins this war, we'll guarantee that the slaves are freed, we'll guarantee that you're freed and you'll be citizens of the British Empire. So the Black Pioneers were groups of soldiers who fought against the American Revolution because they were fighting for their freedom from a new state that wanted to impose or keep slavery. Remember, most of the founding fathers had slaves and were nominally okay with keeping slavery around, although some resisted it. But it doesn't go well for the Black Pioneers. As you might guess, a lot of Americans did not like them, and the United States wins. So the British can't fulfill their promise. So as the war is ending, what do you do with these people? Well, Britain takes these groups of Black pioneers and moves them to Canada, specifically Nova Scotia. That's like the far sort of northeast, right, province in Canada. And so now you have all of these Black folks that have been living in the American South, living in a snowy, oceanic section of like northern Canada. Not great. They weren't very happy with what had happened. So the British government over time decides they're going to resettle these people back in Africa. The reasoning being, hey, you're from Africa, right? You should just be able to go right back there. But most of these people had no necessarily memory of it. Many of them had been born in the United States or the Caribbean. But the British create an opportunity for Peters to lead a section of his community to colonize a new place in Africa that comes to be called Sierra Leone. So Sierra Leone was like a British colony, sort of, but the idea was it would be turned over to Black folks from the Americas who were like repatriating to Africa. So he leads this big group of people. They found Sierra Leone. The capital is Freetown, but sadly Peters dies almost immediately from malaria because none of these African people had been exposed to these diseases. So there was actually a lot of sort of suffering going back because now these people weren't used to that sort of epidemiology that existed there. But again, just an amazing story, right, of this guy. So both of these guys can show the sort of resistance and opposition to slavery that was happening in the transatlantic system, but we can think about it in a much more complex way. There was always resistance to slavery, even as these new cultures are forming, even as new people are sort of emerging from this process. Black folks do not want to be enslaved. It couldn't be any simpler. Resistance to slavery begins the second someone tried to put the first, Black person on a ship. So what did that look like? Well, we can start to think about the individuals that did it, and then we can start to think about the processes. Unfortunately, we don't know much about most individuals who would have resisted slavery because their stories are not necessarily recorded and passed on. But we do know that people were opposed to slavery all over the place, on every side of the Atlantic, and from a variety of different sort of places. They're coming at it from different mentalities, different reasons. So we already looked a little bit last time at Queen Nzinga, right? Remember, she's the ruler from Ndongo that's going to become Angola, right? Angola, the Portuguese colony. So she rules for a really long time. Remember, she's the king who dresses as a man and has sort of a harem of men that dress as women and stuff like that, yeah. So she's involved with lots of wars against the Portuguese, against the Congolese, trying to stop the slave trade and trying to stop colonization. And this is really early stuff. This is like right when the transatlantic slave trade is kicking off. And her idea was that she wanted a sovereign Central African empire that could resist all these outside pressures from Europeans, wouldn't need their guns, wouldn't need their money, wouldn't need to be involved in the process. And as part of this idea, she ends up fighting the Portuguese for decades. When the fighting is kind of over and it's not really working out for anyone, she signs a peace deal with the Portuguese. But unfortunately, the Portuguese are going to kind of go back on everything that she worked for. And in the end, the peace deal is not going to hold up. But it's one example of a ruler just right from the beginning using military and political force to try to stop the trade of people out of Africa. Another sort of site of resistance we might look at is from an unusual place. It's from a Christian convert and sort of using the religious ideology of Europeans to demonstrate why what they were doing in Africa was bad. And so we might look at Donna Beatrice Kimpavite. She was from a noble family. She was born a little bit after people in Congo had started converting to Christianity, so she was Christian already, was raised in a Christian household. But she was also trained as a traditional sort of spiritual healer. So the Christians in Congo had sort of created a syncretic version of Christianity as well. It wasn't like they just ditched all of their African traditions and religion as well. See, so her family thought it was important to make sure she was educated in the sort of older ways, or how to be a sort of spiritual healer in addition to the sort of Christian teachings that they practiced. But she, as late as 1700, reaffirmed her Catholicism, wanted to make sure she was a true Christian, not necessarily being led in weird directions by the sort of local traditions of Congo. And after she had sort of rededicated herself to Christianity, a few years later she got really sick. Yeah. Anyway, she got really sick, and she had a fever, and she started to have visions of a particular Christian saint, Saint Anthony from Padua. And she had these visions where she sort of talked to him, but he was her, and she reinterpreted this afterwards as she got better to mean that she was the reincarnation of Saint Anthony. And she uses this to begin a sort of movement amongst Congolese Christians. She's seen as being imbued with a sort of spiritual power by this vision, and people come to follow her, looking for Christian teachings, looking for sort of spiritual knowledge, esoteric knowledge, that's secret knowledge they can't get anywhere else. And it turns into sort of a political movement. These Antonians, as they call themselves, are going to occupy the former capital and sort of try to set up a government that's aimed at peace. And this is a sort of peace movement that the goal is to end regional conflict. They want to sort of recreate Congo as a Christian empire that is not involved in slavery, not involved in the slave trade, not involved with the Portuguese, sort of a Christian Congolese empire for themselves. And as part of this, she teaches that Jesus and all of the apostles and other early Christians had all been black, and hence they were sort of the true heirs of Christianity, that people in Africa were somehow closer to Christ through the sense of sort of oppression and through their sort of racial history than Europeans. This was great for motivating other Congolese to join her cause, but again, it really freaked out the Portuguese, and they did not like it. They saw this as heresy. When they finally caught her, they burned her as a witch. Here's another depiction of her. She remains really popular actually in Congo for this sort of thing, right? She's sort of leading a peace movement towards a more spiritual and enlightened Congo that would have been not part of the slave trade, right? So really kind of an interesting lady for sure. Then it's hard to keep picking out individuals. Sometimes it's easier to look at groups. So another sort of group you might look at who resisted slavery were all the Maroon communities around the Americas. So these were communities that formed from escaped Africans and indigenous Americans. So very early on, you start to see these forming in the Caribbean. If a ship filled with slaves crashes on an island and they manage to escape, or if people manage to run away to interiors of islands where enslavers can't come after them. So as early as 1512, you see Maroon communities forming in the Caribbean. The most famous one is Jamaica, which probably forms around 1655. Groups of black folks and maybe some Taino folks or other Native Americans who had been in the Caribbean managed to escape the British and get up into the sort of mountainous regions on the north side of Jamaica. Then they form communities that have their own unique sort of individual identity. And when the British try to re-enslave them or force them out of the mountains, they can't. They get a hold of weapons to defend themselves, all these sorts of things. So in the case in Jamaica, the Maroon community is going to fight the British for decades. And eventually the British just get tired of it, and they sign a peace treaty, essentially, with the Maroon community, guaranteeing them freedom on the island, which is just really incredible. So here you have groups coming together, that sort of sense of community survival, but in a much broader way, right, to the point where they can actually resist slavery and resist the sort of transatlantic processes that were happening. Another sort of movement you might look at that's a little bit unexpected because it might not have been taught to you this way is Bacon's Rebellion. So lots of people from this area grow up getting Bacon's Rebellion in history classes and stuff like this. 1676, Nathaniel Bacon is going to lead a revolt against the governor in Virginia, and they're going to eventually burn down Jamestown, right? Jamestown's got it rough for lots of reasons. But what's really weird about Bacon's Rebellion that's not often taught is it was a collection of folks that were poor whites, indentured servants, and black folks that were enslaved. This is really funky because typically we think of race issues and class issues in the United States as very separate, which we shouldn't. And indeed, people at this time didn't distinguish. It's a little bit tricky because, of course, Bacon's Rebellion starts because he wants to kill Native Americans, basically, and he isn't fully authorized to do so. And then there's sort of economic repercussions that happen. And the sort of coalition of poor whites and enslaved blacks that get together are fighting against sort of an oppressive economic system. And when they burn down Jamestown, this scares the hell out of planters and the sort of white leadership. This is when American institutions of slavery actually become much more strict because the white leadership sees that when poor whites and poor blacks get together, they massively outnumber and overpower white elites. And so this is when you start to get much more specific laws about what slaves can do. Slavery is going to become hereditary and stuff like this. The leadership was trying to legally and economically separate white and black folks based on the sort of fears that arose out of this rebellion. So this wasn't necessarily to prevent slavery, but it sort of shows the sort of weird connection and coalition people used to have during this time before they become more sort of separated out. So all of this resistance is going to eventually lead us towards the abolition of slavery, but it is a slow and uneven process. Abolition is going to happen at different times, at different places around the Atlantic, and not everyone is going to get the benefits of freedom in the same way, if at all, for quite a long time. So the abolition of slavery is not like a light switch. It takes a long time and lots of people are involved. Obviously, slaves were working on this from day one, but lots of white folks didn't particularly like slavery either. There were Christian movements that opposed it. There were moral movements that opposed it. But it's going to take a long time for these things to develop and sort of overpower the economic benefits that people were getting from slavery to sort of shut down the system. So people who resisted the slave trade are going to usually call for it to be ended, but not always. There's some sort of tricky business here. So the first thing we might look at for how slavery is going to come to an end is through these sort of Atlantic revolutions. And we're going to talk about the Atlantic revolutions coming this next week. But this is just sort of a preview, and you can kind of get started about thinking about these things. So in 1776, there's a revolutionary new change in the world. You start to get like the first nation states. The US is going to break away from Britain and become a thing. And the whole point of the United States, the whole sort of initial message is liberty, equality, freedom. And these ideas are going to just reverberate around the world, but particularly around the Atlantic. And just like people in France are going to be like, oh, that sounds like a good idea, liberty, freedom, yeah. enslaved communities around the Caribbean, around the United States, Latin America are going to look around and say, oh, hey, yeah, liberty, freedom, that sounds great. How about it? So this is going to really change how people talk about freedom and how they expect freedom to come about. Some of it's going to come through just straight revolution and military success, and we're going to see that a little bit later. For example, the Haitian Revolution, that's depicted here, is just going to be about Black folks rising up and deciding that slavery is over on the island of Haiti. And we're going to see how that works out in a couple lectures. Another driving force for the movement to end slavery comes from Black intellectuals and activists. So remember all those transatlantic people, they're influential. Some of them are great writers, some of them are great public speakers, and they have an effect. They often write their own autobiographies that circulate widely amongst the sort of European and American, like upper middle class whites who want to read about these sorts of things and are curious about the experience of others. For example, here you have Olado Equiano. Sometimes I have people read his book. I'm not having it this term or anything, but he has a book you should check out if you're hip to these sorts of things. Just Google his name. It's his autobiography, basically. He is absolutely incredible. He's captured, most likely, in West Africa. He's brought to the Americas. He serves on different ships in the Caribbean. He manages to save up some money. He goes back to Africa. He goes back to Georgia. He eventually buys his freedom and ends up in London, where he becomes a prominent sort of Christian activist who actually gets like petitions circulating amongst the British royalty to end slavery and stuff like this. It's really amazing. Another person that you might look at for these sorts of movements is Mary Prince. She's coming a little bit after Equiano, right? 1788 is maybe when she's born. She dies in 1833. This is a cover from her first book, Am I Not a Woman and a Sister, right? She was from Bermuda, and she writes her own autobiography. It's the first book published by a Black woman in the UK, and she presents a petition in front of Parliament to end slavery. She was married in Bermuda. Then she was taken to Britain, where she would have had freedom. So she decides to stay, even though her husband is back in the Caribbean, because if she goes back to the Caribbean, she would be re-enslaved. So she's going to stay in London to work as an activist, trying to end slavery. A really incredible story to check out. So these sort of Black intellectuals and authors were activists for the cause, right? They're sort of promoting a particular view. And one way they do this is they say, look at me. I'm a good Christian. I'm intelligent. This is what Black folks could be like. And for a lot of white folks, it's both a scary message, like, ooh, we don't want Black folks to look like that. But it's also kind of, it trips them up because they're hearing other places that Black folks are, completely unteachable. They're just grunt workers and stuff like this. So it really does have an impact on the way people think about these things. Another thing to look at might be the sugar boycotts in the UK. So it wasn't just Black folks that were working for the abolition of slavery. There were also a lot of middle class and elite white folks that wanted to end the process too, particularly in Britain. So slavery was becoming less and less economically important to Britain. The Americans were managing, the United States was managing most of the slave trade, and all of the sort of aspects of slavery in the American South were no longer really contributing to the British economy like they had been. So after the Revolutionary War, a lot of people in Britain are going to start to call for the end of slavery. And it's much easier now because all of those plantations that used to be British and have slaves are now American. So you're like, oh, that's not us. That's the Americans, right? So Parliament is going to reject the first anti-slavery bills, but the idea is in the air. And one particular sort of idea is going to become very popular. William Fox is going to publish this small little pamphlet that's an anti-sugar pamphlet. And it's basically a couple pages, and it talks about how sugar is bad because even though it tastes very sweet in your mouth, it's actually made from the suffering of others. In order to get your sugar somewhere, there has to be enslaved men and women working and dying to produce this cheap product. You might enjoy it, but think about the people who died for you to have it. And he sells thousands of copies of this around the UK, and it becomes a really popular sort of concept, and you start to see sugar boycotts. So here you have a sort of political magazine, the anti-Saccharites, right, are on the right. These are not sweet people. And so you have this ugly lady, and the reason she's ugly is because she's still putting sugar in her man's tea. But if she was all about the cause, she wouldn't be doing that. All of those other women see her as gross because she keeps using sugar unnecessarily. It makes her man happy, but she's contributing to slavery. So this public sort of mobilization is particularly strong amongst Christian women. And the idea is it's a moral thing. It's something that as a good Christian, you should be opposed to slavery, even though other Christians, particularly in the United States, use the Bible as justification for slavery, but we'll get to that later. So this is all corresponding in Britain and Europe to this new idea about social work and philanthropy. And, you know, still today, a lot of philanthropy and volunteer work and stuff like this is done to sort of show you're a good person, or to show how blessed you are, or to sort of show how you're doing the right thing, even though you don't necessarily need to, right? And so these middle class, relatively successful Christian women were getting more and more involved politically and morally to sort of show they were on the right side of history. And that's where a lot of this movement is coming from. Another thing that sort of circulates around this time that's going to really change people's understanding of slavery, it's going to really start to put it in people's faces globally, is the Zong massacre. So this happened in 1781. It's a British ship, the Zhong or Zong, right? People say it differently. It doesn't particularly matter. Don't worry about it. It's coming out of Congo, and for whatever reason, they are going to load the ship up with way more people than normally had. So normally they would put 200 slaves on it and take it across the Atlantic to the Caribbean. But this time they put 442 people on it, so more than double what they normally do. When they pull into Jamaica, there's only 208 people left alive on the ship, the slaves. Meaning, more than half of the slaves they put on the ship died while crossing the Atlantic. So this was really high, right? Remember, statistically, over the whole course of transatlantic slavery, it's about 25%. So certainly more than double. But by this point, the death rate had gone down, so way higher than normal. And what sort of starts to slowly leak out is that it was on purpose. So as it turns out, the crew and the captain had taken out really big insurance policies against losing slaves on the ship. So when they got to Jamaica and more than half of their cargo had died, they went right away to the insurance offices and said, oh man, horrible accident, you know, we're going to need to collect that insurance money and get money back for all of these slaves. So they could still sell almost their normal amount of slaves and get insurance on almost their normal amount of slaves, making a huge profit. But this seemed really off to a lot of people. The insurance company started looking into it, and once they started to figure out what happened, the sort of nature of this became clear how horrible it was. They had intentionally murdered half of the people and thrown them overboard in order to collect insurance. So there was this lengthy trial in the UK, or in the Caribbean and sort of in the UK. It was a British trial that shows that the captain of the ship intentionally did this. They murdered these people. They tried to collect the insurance money, and how this was really horrible. But the trial was not about protecting the people or, oh, it was horrible that you killed these people. The trial was about how horrible it was that you're trying to defraud insurance, right? So that's weird. However, by the end of the trial, when all this evidence was presented, this was sort of the early days of mass newspaper. Tons and tons of people around the Atlantic world were reading about this. And they were reading about the sort of the trial, the insurance company trying to prove they didn't have to pay the insurance. But they were also reading about just how horrible the slave trade was. And these were the sorts of things that were happening even kind of late in the slave trade as people were sort of trying to end the business. So this was a very sort of influential event in terms of public opinion. Another really influential sort of pamphlet or sort of image that circulated during this time was the image of the Brooks. So when you're talking about slavery or when you're thinking about it, if you haven't seen it, or if you don't get a sense of how bad it was, it's easy to sort of deny it. To say, well, you know, oh yeah, some slaves aren't happy or whatever, but I don't know, who knows. But so what this was that you're looking at was a diagram that started to circulate around Britain and then later around the United States and other places, that was an actual sort of picture of how a slave ship was loaded and what it looked like. So this is the plan for stowage of 292 slaves, 100 of them being stowed under shelves that are not actually shown. So what you're seeing is all the people on the top shelf, and then under them there was a whole another shelf of people. So you have the top deck and bottom deck showing you how these slaves were loaded into the ship for their several week-long journey across the Atlantic. It's absolutely incredible. They said there's a height of 2 feet and 7 inches between the beams and where the people are in the ship. So you have basically a shelf that's 2.5 feet tall that you can obviously barely roll around in, and you're packed just shoulder to shoulder with people. Where do these people eat? Where do they go to the bathroom? What happens if they're sick? What happens if they're giving birth? All these sorts of things. What happens if one of them dies in there? People begin to look at this and think, oh my God, this is absolutely horrifying. The conditions of these people. And this was, again, relatively late. This is 1788, and this was produced to show the sort of horrors of the average slaving ship as Britain was trying to end the trade. And once you see something like this and you think about what this must have been like for these people, it's really hard to be like, well, slavery is not that bad, you know, or something like that. Even just this very specific launching off point. This is before they're put to work. This is before their freedom of movement is completely limited into where they're going to live. This is before they're punished for mundane things. This is before they're raped to produce new children, which was a very, very common thing, particularly in the United States. So this is just the very start of the sort of horror for these people in the slave trade. And British people started to look at this and think, wow, man, we got to do something else. So all of these ideas and images and people and books are going to come together and sort of create a general social push to end the slave trade in the 19th century, but it's a really uneven thing. It's a slow rollout. Creolization that we looked at earlier is the same thing. It's going to be across time. It's going to be a slow rolling process that's going to change whole cultures, whole demographics, whole people, and create brand new societies. And when those societies do eventually get their freedom with the abolition of slavery, they're going to have to figure out what to do next. and that's going to be a couple lectures from now, a few lectures down the road. We're going to start to look at that. But just remember, it's a slow process. It's uneven. The results are different all over. Even once people have freedom, it doesn't mean the same thing everywhere. So we'll see more of that. All right, well, next time we're going to talk about the East, whatever that means, before 1800 or so. Please read that chapter in the book 26. And as always, let me know if you have any questions. You can email me or whatever. Talk to you then.